B550 ITX motherboards aim to be the sweet spot for small form factor enthusiasts, offering most of X570's functionality at a reduced price. And recently, we took a look at the cheapest B550 ITX motherboard for your Ryzen CPUs to see if it's even worth considering. But today, we're going the other end of the spectrum. This is the Asus ROG STRIX B550i Gaming, the most expensive B550 ITX motherboard. Depending on how inflated pricing is when you watch this video, this sits at about double the price of the cheapest B550 ITX motherboard and about $70 cheaper than its X570 brother from Asus. So we're going to look into what you get for your money by going over its features, including both the internal and rear I/O connectors. I'm then going to go over CPU cooler compatibility and discuss VRM thermals before we wrap up this video by talking about an exciting update to the Asus RGB ecosystem for you RGB lovers. And I also have an important question to ask you guys a bit later, so stay with me. But first, a message from today's video sponsor. Whokeys is a one-stop place for cheap games and software, allowing you to buy games and software keys significantly cheaper than the full price retail version. To try out the service, I personally bought a Windows 10 Pro license for under $14 using the TechLens coupon code TL20. Not only was the process incredibly simple, but I got one of my Windows machines fully activated for over 90% less than the full price retail version. This allows you to not only get rid of that annoying watermark, especially for you streamers, but also do other things you might not realize, like unlock the ability to customize your Windows theme, change the name of your PC, and really make your computer your computer. So check out Whokeys today using the link in the video description, and don't forget to apply your 20% off coupon using the code TL20. So before we get into the features of the Asus B550i gaming motherboard, let's take a look at what you get inside the box, what the board looks like, and what accessories Asus have decided to include with this premium B550 ITX board. You are firstly greeted with the motherboard itself, and it looks absolutely stunning. Asus really know how to design hardware, and I don't think I've met anybody that doesn't appreciate the Asus design aesthetic. It just looks like it's built to perform, with a really nice touch of flair coming from the iridescent mirror on the Asus logo. But I am going to knock off a point for the lack of RGB elements built into the board. Don't worry, it does have RGB headers, and we will get into that in a bit, but it's a $230 board. It should have at least some RGB built in. So moving on to the accessories, we get a non-integrated I/O shield. I'm not sure how I feel about this. But next up, we have a USB Type-C to 3.5mm audio adapter, which we will find out what that's for in a bit. Included are 4 SATA cables total, 2 of which have a right angle connector on one side. You also get a 3-pin 5050 to 3-pin JST SM addressable RGB adapter. This is a great thing to see, as these are super useful. There's also some mounting hardware for the 2 M.2 drives, and you get the typical Asus front panel extension. Other than that, there's some zip ties and the really good looking Asus Wi-Fi antenna, which then brings us onto the RTFM documentation, which has a really cool Asus branded coaster inside and a thank you note behind it. Then lastly, and most importantly, your Asus sticker pack. So let's pack all of this up, bring back the board itself, and have a look at what you can plug into it, as this will tell us a lot about the features. Starting at the bottom of the board, you have a sneakily hidden front panel audio header, your primary M.2, which is both raised via a daughter board and sits underneath the chunky heatsink. Next to that, you have headers for a clear CMOS jumper, a thermal sensor, and your USB 2.0. This takes us up the right hand side of the board, where you have 4 SATA ports, a single USB 3, and your USB Type-C connector, which is either Gen 1 or Gen 2, depending on whether you believe the website or the manual. Moving further up, you have your labelled front panel headers, an internal speaker connector, and your motherboard's 24-pin power, which takes us to the top of the board, where you'll find your motherboard diagnostic LEDs. These are super useful for troubleshooting. And next to that, you have your RGB headers, both a 4-pin non-addressable and a 3-pin addressable header. For fan connectors, there are 3 4-pin PWM fan headers labelled as CPU pump and chassis, next to a micro fan header dedicated for your VRM, and the CPU's 8-pin EPS connector. And the last 2 things that I want to show you are the secondary M.2 connector on the back of the board and the BIOS battery connector, sat inconveniently behind the BIOS flashback button, where the I/O shield would be in the way. So what does this tell us about the board? Well, I do wish it had more fan headers, but I guess you could use splitters and adapters, but otherwise it does have a great all-round feature set with everything that you'd expect and some more. Of course, the biggest selling points of B550 is that you get guaranteed future compatibility with Zen 3 CPUs, and also PCIe Gen 4 to the primary and only PCI slot for ITX boards, but also to the primary M.2 slot. This does mean that the secondary M.2 slot on the rear is Gen 3, but honestly, if you're wondering whether you need a Gen 4 storage device, you probably don't need a Gen 4 storage device. Gen 3 is more than fast enough outside of really specific use cases, more tailored towards stuff like data science. But there are a few noteworthy things that I want to highlight about this board and make you aware of them. Number 1, and one thing that might potentially trigger my OCD, is this placement for the front panel audio header. I don't see a way to cleanly route this out of sight without routing it underneath your primary M.2 drive, to then route the cable underneath the GPU. I mean, it's doable, it's just kind of annoying. Also, the primary M.2 and VRM heatsink do stand tall off the motherboard. This will likely help with M.2 temperatures, as the GPU can easily force air underneath it too, but the fact that it stands tall may interfere with downfiring coolers. This was a big problem for me with the Asus C390i gaming motherboard, so we will test that for you guys in a bit. And yes, I completely agree with what you're probably thinking right now. Some of these things seem a little nitpicky, but bear in mind that this is the most expensive B550 ITX board. No compromises is what it should strive for, and that's exactly how I'm going to judge it. So let's take a look at the rear end before we test cooler clearance and talk about a pretty cool RGB update from Asus. You'll find the typical HDMI and DisplayPort connectors next to a total of 4 USB Type-A ports, with 3 of those using USB 3 Gen 2 and the other one using a USB 2.0 connection, also used for BIOS flashback. You get 2 USB Type-Cs, one of which using USB 3 Gen 2, and the other is intended for audio use but could also be used for a USB 2.0 connection. Speaking of audio, you get a 3-line audio solution with a decent chipset that does self-illuminate when the computer is turned on. Nice touch. You also get a dedicated BIOS flashback button, and this is one of those things that you won't need until you really need it, and then it becomes an absolute lifesaver. So I really appreciate this feature. And lastly, for networking, you have 2.5 gig Ethernet and dual band Wi-Fi 6, basically the highest performing technologies that you could expect on a mainstream motherboard in this category. So this is actually a pretty good loadout for B550 rear I/O, given the chipset limitations over X570, and I'll drop some recommended adapters below for you in case you need to expand the functionality. But the audio chipset is great, and I especially appreciate that all the USB 3 ports are Gen 2, offering up to 10 gigabits per second transfer rate, meaning they are twice the performance of USB 3 Gen 1 ports. And the fact that you get a BIOS flashback button, as I mentioned before, you won't need this until you really need this, and then you won't want a board without it. As for networking, Wi-Fi 6 does have some really cool features, which you can check out up here. But as for 2.5 gig Ethernet, this isn't going to help you with your internet speeds until 2 things happen. Number 1, your service provider offers a plan with more than a gigabit connection, and number 2, you're willing to pay for whatever that cost would be. So why the push? You might have noticed a lot of B550 boards with 2.5 gig Ethernet. Well, future compatibility does get thrown around quite often, but right now the people that are going to find this useful are those who have devices that are 2.5 gig and above on their local network, a home storage server for example, which is becoming more common and something that I plan on building soon. So if you're in this category, you're going to be jumping for joy that integrated 2.5 gig networking on a mainstream platform is becoming more standard. I guess 2020 hasn't been a complete write-off. So let's take a look at the all-important CPU cooler compatibility and discuss VRM thermals before we look at another new Asus RGB integration into Corsair iCUE. As for CPU cooler fitment, distance to the top of the board and the memory are going to be pretty much the same as other modern ITX boards, but the areas for concern are the bottom where the daughter board for the M.2 lives and the left-hand side where the VRM heatsink is. And because of that, the important information that you need to know is the M.2 daughter board is 38mm away from the bottom edge of the socket and stands 23mm tall. The VRM and I/O cover on the other hand is best measured in 3 different stages, ranging from 16mm away, 7mm tall, to 35mm away, 42mm tall. So hopefully you can work out whether the cooler you want to install will fit based on those measurements. For example, the Black Ridge cooler won't fit, but the ID Cooling IS60 and the new IS47K will fit. Comparative review on those coming soon, by the way. Make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss that. But as for VRM thermals, this Asus board holds up really well compared to the competition. That's going to be more than capable of handling even a 16-core 3950X. I'm going to leave a link below to a B550 ITX VRM comparison video. But if we use optimum text numbers, this Asus board does extremely well, coming in middle of the pack for stock boost clocks, top for CPU temp, and about 68C for the VRM, which is a very good result whilst using a 16-core CPU. I would do the testing myself with the hardware I have, but I'm actually moving house at the moment. We might have to revisit this. So, a software element that I wanted to touch on before I ask you a really important question is the Asus RGB solution. This can of course be controlled through the Asus Aura software, and although it does have some really cool features, I rated it 2nd out of 4 in my review video of all motherboard manufacturers' RGB solutions. But the best thing about Asus RGB, funnily enough, isn't Asus. Recent Asus motherboards, including the B550i gaming, can be integrated into Corsair iCUE, allowing you to control onboard RGB and RGB headers using the iCUE management software. Arguably, the best RGB software, including light linking effects across all your compatible devices. The only caveat to that is that at time of filming, addressable headers on compatible motherboards still currently don't work with iCUE. I'm personally hoping that they sort this out soon, but I've been using the Commander Pro and the Lighting Node Pro for connecting addressable RGB devices, such as digital RGB strips, fans, and case lighting, until they sort this out, along with checking out this video of how to get other non-Corsair RGB working with iCUE. But what about that exciting update that I alluded to earlier? Well, recently, iCUE integrated Asus GPUs as well, So if you're using iQOO and have an Asus GPU, update iQOO now, thank me later, and comment below the 2 things wrong with this image. So ultimately, the Asus ROG STRIX B550i Gaming is a great board, offering a full B550 feature set, a strong VRM solution, and a design to match. Compared to the B550 ITX motherboards from MSI, Gigabyte, and the ASRock Phantom Gaming, they are pretty comparable to one another, but with the Asus board you're getting the Corsair integration, which is a big plus and can reduce RGB conflicts and bugginess, one of the highest rated memory overclocking in its class, BIOS flashback, and a BIOS that is preferred by most, but it is pretty pricey, which makes you think, you're already spending $230, maybe it's just worth spending a bit extra and getting the X570i Gaming from Asus, the board that I'm currently running in my personal system. See, this is something that I'm actually considering, but the opposite way round. The main benefits of the X570 board is that you get PCIe Gen 4 to both M.2s instead of just the primary, a boatload of rear I/O, and a stronger VRM solution. But the VRM on the B550 board is more than capable, and even with coding and a lot of video editing, I definitely won't need both M.2s to be PCIe Gen 4. Admittedly, the reduced rear I/O compared to X570 is a bit of a bummer, but I could make do with using a USB hub or two. But what I would primarily be gaining is that 2.5 gig Ethernet for NAS devices and future high-speed networking. So especially if you're thinking about purchasing one or the other, the X570 with the higher price tag is a tough sell. But what do you think that I should do? What would you do if it was your money? Let me know in the comments. So check out this board and my other recommendations in the description, and if you want to see more videos like this, get subscribed with notifications. We should be the first channel checking out some really unique ITX cases soon, so make sure that you don't miss that, but otherwise a like is always appreciated, and I will see you in the next one.